The 25 Curiosities about the Three Wise Men. Number 25. Inclusion in decorative arts. In addition to the best-known expressions in painting, sculpture, and manuscripts, the image of the three wise men was integrated into the decorative arts through everyday and luxurious objects. Chests, portable altarpieces, carved ivories, and pieces of goldsmithing frequently displayed scenes of the Epiphany as a central or secondary motif. These works, some intended for the nobility and others for liturgical worship, attest to the importance given to the adoration of the Magi, a symbol of the universal adoration of Christ. The choice of motifs related to the three wise men in objects for personal or ceremonial use reaffirmed the piety and prestige of their owners, who identified with the devotion and nobility of these biblical characters. By seeing the scene reproduced in various artisanal manifestations, the story of the Epiphany was fixed not only in the collective mind, but also in the cultural fabric of daily life, confirming the roots and admiration that the Magi from the East aroused. Number 24. Adoption in Gothic art. With the arrival of Gothic art, the representation of the Magi acquired a more stylized and at the same time more narrative tone. The verticality and dynamism of the Gothic cathedrals were reflected in the porticos, stained glass windows, and altarpieces in which the Epiphany occupied a prominent place. The search for greater expressiveness led to an emphasis on the gestures and interaction between the kings and the Holy Family, giving the scene a dramatic and emotional character. During this period, the creation of polychrome altarpieces made it possible to capture in detail the royal attire, crowns, and gifts. Gothic workshops, by mixing local influences with new artistic impulses, developed an iconography that could alternate between decorative fantasy and the fusion of Eastern and European motifs. Thus, the adoration of the Magi was transformed into a scene of profound splendor, a synthesis of the religious message and the refined aesthetics that characterized Gothic art. Number 23. Appearance in medieval stained glass. The use of stained glass in Gothic churches transformed the way of telling biblical stories, and the scene of the Epiphany was no exception. In order to educate and amaze the faithful, the stained glass windows showed the arrival of the Magi in Bethlehem with a multicolored light that passed through the glass, giving the scene an aura of transcendence. The kings were often presented with richly decorated clothing and distinctive headdresses, enhanced by the luminosity of the glass. These stained glass windows were the result of a meticulous artisanal process, which involved cutting and painting each piece and then joining it with lead. The final effect gave the temples an enveloping atmosphere, where the contemplation of light and sacred stories nourished the spiritual experience of the faithful. The Epiphany, with its story of revelation and worship, found in stained glass an ideal medium to reinforce the idea of the light of Christ that illuminates all nations. Number 22. Absence of biographical data. Despite the enormous impact of the story of the three wise men in Christian tradition, the canonical Gospels barely provide biographical details about them. Their exact origin, their previous occupations, or the course of their lives after meeting the child Jesus are unknown. This lack of information contributed to the creation of legendary and apocryphal stories that, with greater or lesser credibility, attempted to satisfy the curiosity of the faithful about the fate of those mysterious wise men. The scant biblical information, however, left the door open to a rich diversity of artistic and literary interpretations throughout the centuries. Precisely this ambiguity allowed the figure of the three wise men to adapt to multiple cultural contexts, facilitating their rooting in devotional practices and popular traditions. Part of their appeal lies in this evangelical simplicity, as they became enigmatic characters capable of symbolizing the universal search for the sacred. English, number 21. Early Greek references. Some of the earliest commentaries and reflections on the story of the Magi came from the Hellenistic Christian sphere. Greek-speaking church fathers, such as Origen and Eusebius of Caesarea, addressed the visit of the Eastern sages to the child Jesus, seeking connections with Greek philosophy and Jewish tradition. From their perspective, the episode confirmed the universality of Christian revelation, since even pagan sages recognized the divine kingship of Christ. In these writings, the mention of the Magi was often related to astrology, a discipline that enjoyed a certain prestige in the ancient world. The sighting of the star was interpreted as a cosmic sign that the reason and astronomical experience of these men could decipher. Thus, the gospel narrative was provided with an intellectual background that further elevated the sense of the Epiphany as an event that transcends cultural boundaries. Number 20. Appearance in the ancient liturgy. From early times, the Feast of the Epiphany was integrated into the liturgical calendar, commemorating both the baptism of Christ and the adoration of the Magi according to Eastern tradition. This celebration, which varies according to Christian rites and confessions, gave a central place to the visit of the Magi as a symbol of the manifestation of the Messiah to all peoples. In the East, the Epiphany took on a broader theophanic tone, while in the West the adoration of the kings and their gifts were emphasized. In the first centuries, the prayers, readings, and songs for the day of the Epiphany highlighted the humanity and divinity of Christ, extolling the arrival of the Magi as a testimony that salvation extends beyond Israel. In this way, the liturgy offered a community context where the figure of the kings was present not only in historical memory, but in the celebratory and ecclesial experience of the Christian communities dispersed throughout the empire and beyond. Number 19. Representations with the Phrygian cap. In some early Christian and medieval works of art, the Magi appear wearing the Phrygian cap, a conical hat with a point that fell forward, common in Eastern iconography. This detail sought to accentuate their Eastern origin and differentiate them from other biblical characters from Palestine or Rome. The Phrygian cap, also associated with Persia and nearby regions, underlined the exoticism of the wise men and reinforced their status as astrologers or priests from distant lands. In antiquity, the use of the Phrygian cap was a distinctive feature on coins, sculptures, and reliefs that represented Eastern people or divinities. Their adaptation to the Christian context of the adoration of the Magi was an effective visual resource to place these characters in the collective imagination, affirming their origin while transmitting the notion of the universality of the gospel message. Number 18. First mentions of their gifts. The explicit reference to the gifts of gold, incense, and myrrh appears in the Gospel of Matthew, emphasizing their symbolic nature. From very early on, the fathers of the Church commented on the importance of each gift. The gold alluded to Jesus' royalty, the incense to his divinity, and the myrrh, used in the anointing of corpses, to his human destiny and his future passion. This triple interpretation consolidated the relevance of the Magi as bearers of deep theological meanings. In later art and devotion, the giving of the gifts became the culminating moment of the Epiphany scene. Painters, sculptors, and miniaturists meticulously depicted ornate chests and vessels rich in detail, seeking to reflect the preciousness of what was offered. The iconic composition itself, with the kings bowing before the child and the mother, reinforced the idea of Christ's sovereignty and the homage of all the peoples of the earth. Number 17. Absence of reference to animals. A notable difference between the scene of the Magi and other episodes related to the birth of Jesus is the absence of reference to animals that accompany them. While the manger evokes the presence of the ox and the mule, or the shepherds leading sheep, the Magi do not have an iconic animal that appears systematically in the biblical story. However, in later representations, some artists imagined camels or dromedaries to underline the distant origin of the wise men. The presence of camels in the iconography of the Epiphany became popular due to the association with Oriental caravans and with the exotic wealth attributed to the kings. Even so, it is a later addition and not a fact from the Gospel text. This creative freedom shows how the popular imagination and artistic tradition were completing scenic elements that intensified the idea of the great journey undertaken by the Magi in search of the Star of Bethlehem. Number 16. Numerical diversity in ancient traditions. Although the Western tradition ended up establishing the number of 3 Magi, in Christian antiquity there was a notable diversity in this regard. Some communities spoke of 2 Magi, while other stories mentioned 4 or even 12. In places such as Armenia or Ethiopia, ecclesiastical texts described a number other than the conventional one, reflecting the ductility of tradition in its early stages. The adoption of the number 3 became popular due to its association with the gifts mentioned in Matthew and its Trinitarian symbolism. Over time, devotion and art took care of giving it such a hold that today it is almost impossible to dissociate the Magi from the number of 3. But this apparent uniformity hides the variants that have enriched the story, adapting it to cultural contexts and devotional needs. Number 15. Multiple languages in its stories. The story of the Magi, initially spread through the Gospel of Matthew in Greek, was translated very early on into numerous ancient Christian languages, such as Syriac, Coptic, and Latin. Each of these versions brought nuances and sometimes divergences in the use of words, which led to slightly different interpretations. Likewise, exegetical commentaries in these languages contributed to forming a theological and cultural basis for the adoration of the Magi in different regions. Over time, more translations appeared in European, African, and Asian vernacular languages. These texts facilitated the spread of the story in countries far from the Holy Land, feeding the local imagination and giving rise to their own traditions. This linguistic and cultural multiplicity demonstrates the ability of the Magi narrative to transcend borders and take root in very diverse communities, integrating itself into their faith and artistic expressions. Number 14. Frescoes in churches in the Middle East. Middle Eastern churches, from late antiquity and the Byzantine period, feature frescoes and icons that emphasize the visit of the Magi, highlighting the significance of the Epiphany. These depictions, made using encaustic or egg tempera techniques, show the wise men in highly ornate clothing and with facial features closer to the Oriental typology. Often, the figure of Joseph was also included, thus expanding the family composition of the scene. By placing the Magi in a setting that may recall the local geography, Middle Eastern artists established ties of proximity with the story, reinforcing the community sense of the celebration. Thus, regional iconographic and liturgical traditions merged, contributing to the evolution of the story and adapting it to the sensibilities of those Christian communities that saw in the story of the Magi a testimony of their own historical continuity in the faith. Number 13. Early inscriptions. Inscriptions have been found in some archaeological remains and ancient ecclesiastical buildings that mention the Epiphany or, to a lesser extent, the Magi themselves. These inscriptions, sometimes carved in stone or in mosaics, were used to record the dedication of a temple, commemorate the celebration of the feast, or exalt the mystery of the Incarnation and the manifestation of Christ. They are usually brief, but they bear witness to the early veneration of the episode by the faithful. The discovery of these inscriptions is important for historical research, since it confirms the wide acceptance of the story of the Magi in the context of early Christianity. Although they do not provide great details about the characters, they reflect the fervor and relevance attributed to them, as well as the need to fix in the memory of the communities their arrival in Bethlehem as a symbol of the salvation offered to all peoples. Number 12. Influence on Carolingian miniatures. In the Carolingian era, with the Emperor Charlemagne's drive to revitalize Christian culture and faith, the art of miniature reached a renewed splendor. Holy books were adorned with colorful and meticulous illustrations, including scenes of the Nativity and the Epiphany. Within these miniatures, the representation of the Magi stood out for its chromatic richness and the use of gold backgrounds, with a clear purpose of enhancing the divinity of the child and the royal rank of his visitors. Carolingian illumination schools, such as those of Tours and Reims, developed a style that fused Roman and insular tradition, giving rise to a unique iconography. In this context, the scene of the adoration of the Magi reaffirmed the universal power of Christianity, something that fit perfectly with the imperial aspirations of the Carolingian court. Thus, miniatures became a testimony of official devotion and at the same time an instrument of religious instruction for the nobility and the clergy. Number 11. Diversity of attire throughout the centuries. Throughout the history of Christian art, the attire of the Magi has undergone notable transformations, reflecting both the aesthetic changes of each era and the need to underline their foreign and distinguished status. In early works, they were seen wearing simple tunics and cloaks, while in the Middle Ages they began to appear with crowns and luxurious clothing, often of Byzantine or Islamic inspiration. The Renaissance introduced designs more in line with European court fashion, with silks, brocades, and more elaborate jewelry. This dynamism in clothing responds to the intention of showing the Magi as exotic characters and at the same time close to the spectator of the moment. By adopting details from different cultures or periods, the representations reinforce the notion that the wise men came from faraway places, while allowing the public to identify with them. In this way, the figure of the three wise men retains an extraordinary iconographic richness to this day, which testifies to the vitality of their legend in the development of Christian art. Number 10. Early representations without crowns. In the first artistic manifestations of Christianity, the Magi did not appear crowned or wearing royal insignia. In the frescoes of the catacombs and early Christian sarcophagi, male figures could be seen bowing down offering gifts, often in simple attire or with oriental caps instead of crowns. This initial way of representing them responded to the intention of emphasizing their role as wise men or astrologers from faraway lands, rather than enhancing a monarchical rank that had not yet been associated with them. The adoption of the title of king occurred gradually, partly due to the theological reading of the Old Testament prophecies and the need to show Christ as the supreme king to whom other sovereigns submitted. However, the earliest plastic works maintained the sobriety of the Magi's attire, reflecting an interpretation closer to the text of Matthew, where they are described as magicians or wise men. Thus, these early artistic vestiges offer a unique window into the iconographic evolution that would later crown visitors with symbols of royalty. Number 9. Exhibition in museums. Various artistic pieces depicting the three wise men, from carved ivories to painted panels, have been preserved and, over the centuries, brought together in prestigious collections. Museums in different countries now exhibit altarpieces, sculptures, and illuminated manuscripts that show the scene of the Epiphany in all its richness. These museum collections, made up mainly of donations, acquisitions, or recoveries from temples and private collections, have allowed historians and scholars to delve deeper into the variety of styles and periods. The exhibition of these works in a museum context facilitates detailed contemplation of the composition, the features of the physiognomy, the painting technique, or the sculptural reliefs. Each piece also tells its own story of origin, often linked to a specific chapel or monastery. In this way, the exhibition of the Magi in museums not only enriches the cultural heritage, but also encourages a continuous dialogue with the past and a renewed perception of the symbolism surrounding adoration. Number 8. Early Christian frescoes without details of origin. Early Christian frescoes depicting the Magi often show a symbolic rather than narrative approach. In them, the figures appear without specific indications of geographical origin or social rank, reflecting the priority of communicating the universality of the manifestation of Christ. Such scenes focused on the gesture of offering and the presence of the star, thus reinforcing the liturgical and devotional dimension of the image. The absence of details about the origin of the Magi in these early frescoes is explained by the catechetical intention of the iconography, to capture the great mysteries of the Christian faith in a direct manner, without the need for trappings or superfluous elements. Over the centuries, art would evolve to introduce more elaborate features, but in these primordial testimonies we can perceive the germ of devotion to the Epiphany, centered on the humility of the birth and the reverent response of those who recognize the divine mystery. Number 7. Influence of Byzantine art. Byzantine art played a fundamental role in the way the Magi were represented, especially through mosaics and icons made in Constantinople and other cities of the Eastern Empire. The use of gold backgrounds, the stylization of the figures, and solemn attitudes influenced later iconography, both in the Western and Eastern spheres. The Magi, dressed in rich clothing and even with touches of Persian influence, acquired an air of majesty and transcendence. This Byzantine imprint also strengthened the idea of a triumphant epiphany, in which the sumptuousness of the garments emphasized the heavenly glory revealed on earth. Furthermore, the hieratic and frontal style of the compositions underlined the solemnity of the encounter between the human and the divine. Thus, the Byzantine tradition brought an additional sophistication to the adoration of the Magi, which the art of the Western regions would later receive, incorporating Oriental features in the representation of these wise men. Number 6. Representation in carved ivory. Ivory carving was one of the most highly prized artistic techniques in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. Consular diptychs and liturgical chests are examples where the scene of the Epiphany could be depicted in minute detail, thanks to the ductility and natural beauty of the material. The contrast between the light background of the ivory and the fine reliefs allowed the gestures, the folds of the vestments, and the delivery of gifts to be highlighted with great precision. These carvings, often small in format, circulated between palatial courts and episcopal sees, functioning as objects of prestige and devotion. On their delicate surfaces, the Magi appeared in different attire from that of the Holy Family, underlining their foreign character. Ivory work, due to its quality and difficulty, was usually reserved for the most valuable representations, and the visit of the kings to the child Jesus was one of the sacred moments that were considered worthy of this artistic care. Number 5. Great frequency in Romanesque portals. Romanesque architecture, with its churches with thick walls and semicircular arches, gave a privileged place to the Epiphany in the sculpture of portals and capitals. On the main portal or on some side portals, the faithful could contemplate the relief of the three wise men advancing towards Mary and the child, sometimes guided by the star or accompanied by elusive inscriptions. This repeated presence in the portals underlines the relevance that the adoration of the Magi had in catechism and in popular devotion. In many cases, Romanesque combined a narrative sense with a strong symbolic charge. The representation of the Magi together with other scenes from the life of Christ became a true stone Bible, accessible even to the illiterate. In addition, the variety of styles between different regions revealed how the story of the kings could be expressed in more rigid or softer forms, according to the schools and workshops of each area. In this way, the scene of the Epiphany became a fundamental element in the monumental sculpture of the time. Number 4. Various artistic supports. The versatility of the story of the Magi has allowed its representation in a wide range of artistic supports, from the smallest detail of a cameo to the grandeur of an altarpiece. In tapestries, for example, not only the visit to Bethlehem was recreated with colored threads and precious metals, but also the tour guided by the star. Similarly, tempera or fresco painting, sculpture in stone or wood, and even cloisonné enamel reflected the adoration on multiple scales and contexts. This range of techniques and formats speaks of the deep roots of the scene in all social classes, given that the pieces could be as modest as a small domestic panel or as sumptuous as the frontal of a high altar. In each case, the objective remained the same: to immortalize the search and homage of some wise men who recognized in the child Jesus the sign of a cosmic and universal order. Across centuries and styles, the diversity of supports gave new life to the same story, confirming the capacity of the Epiphany to inspire creative ingenuity. Number 3. Early indirect sources. Among the earliest indirect sources that allude to the Magi, there are comments by the Fathers of the Church and chronicles that, without describing the scene in detail, mention the presence of astrologers or wise men from the East at the time of Christ's birth. These allusions, often very brief, served as a basis for the later construction of legends around the kings. They were also supplemented by apocryphal works that, without being officially recognized, provided information about their names, paths, and motivations. These indirect mentions offer an overview of the diversity of interpretations that circulated in the Christian communities of the first centuries. In some cases, the writings focus on the astrological aspect, while in others they highlight the humility with which they offer their gifts. However, the coincidence in their role as witnesses to the divinity of Jesus cemented the importance of the Magi, whose figures would continue to grow in popularity and iconography over time. Number 2. Consolidation in the Middle Ages. It was during the Middle Ages that the tradition of the three wise men acquired its most defined and enduring form. Speculations about their names, ages, and origins were combined with the attribution of royal titles, captured in multiple artistic formats and popular narratives. At the same time, popular devotion and the cult of the relics linked to them promoted an unprecedented religious and cultural dynamism, making the Epiphany one of the key moments of the Christian calendar. During this period, the typology that we recognize was established: three visitors of varied age and ethnicity, offering gold, incense, and myrrh to the child God. The consolidation of this image in councils, sermons, and iconographic cycles left a lasting impact. By the late Middle Ages, the Magi became fundamental pillars of the Christian imagination, appearing on church doorways, illuminated manuscripts, and altarpieces that, as a whole, testified to the centrality of adoration as a symbol of the universal acceptance of Christ. Number 1. Persistence of the visual narrative. The scene of the visit of the Magi has demonstrated an exceptional capacity to survive in the Western artistic tradition, crossing styles, periods, and geographical regions. From the early Christian catacombs to the great medieval cathedrals, and passing through the meticulous work of the Renaissance workshops, the adoration of the Magi has been nourished by the aesthetic currents of each era. Its message of recognition and offering before the divine has maintained its symbolic meaning, adapting to the needs of spirituality and artistic expression. The universality expressed by the Epiphany, with wise men arriving from remote lands to honor a child, has been at the base of its persistence. Each generation of artists has found in the Magi an ideal subject to capture mystery, royalty, and humility, offering new visual visions that nevertheless maintain the essential features of the original narrative. This interweaving of history, art, and devotion has ensured that the Epiphany scene continues to inspire admiration and study, becoming one of the most deeply rooted visual narratives in cultural memory. Thank you for watching our video. Subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. Give it a like, comment your thoughts, and share this video with your friends and family.